Hi, everyone, and welcome. For those of you who are just joining us, my name is Teralyn Parr, and I am the director of the Bisexual Research Group, and I am very happy to be introducing our next speaker. Dr. Rosie Nelson is a lecturer in gender at the University of Bristol. Their sociological exploration of LGBTQ+ experiences focuses on representation justice, and how individuals live well in difficult environments. Rosie's particular focus is on bi+, non-binary, and trans identities, as well as queer and feminist qualitative research methods. They are currently finishing a book entitled Making Space for Bi+ Identities, Explorations of Gender, Identities, and Relationships, which will be released in 2023. And I've had the privilege of getting a sneak peek of Rosie's upcoming book, and I can say that it is a fantastic and comprehensive review of all of the facets that make bi+ identities unique and worthy of study, independent of the broader LGBTQ community. Their book is a must-read for anyone interested in understanding more about how bi people interpret, interact with, and experience identity and gender in their lives, and the impact that heteronormativity and monosexism have on how bi people are understood by others. So without further ado, I will pass things over to you, Rosie.
Thanks for that really kind and warm introduction, Teralyn. So I'm just going to get it so that I can share my slides. So can anyone just shout out that they can see them? Is that working for everyone?
Yes, Roger, we can see them.
Awesome, brilliant. Thank you so much. I've having taught online for the last 2 years, I know it's always worth checking. So yes, my name is Rosie Nelson and I use they, them pronouns. I'm currently a lecturer in gender at the University of Bristol. And I've been very kindly invited here to talk about the clinging myth of bi privilege in passing. So you joined me at the beginning of me encountering this topic. So I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts and questions at the end of this talk, because this is something that I'm beginning anew on, and I'm currently in the process of thinking, you know, sort of how I'm framing it. So many of you are very likely familiar with the age-old saying, it seems, that bi people have straight passing privilege, and that bi people have it easier than many others because of the ability to negotiate and pass and weave through heterosexual spaces. Now, the reason that I'm engaging in this topic to kind of try and dismantle and counter that view is because it fills me with rage. So essentially, I would not argue that bi people have straight passing privilege. And in fact, I will argue in this talk quite strongly against that. So I'm going to go through quite a lot. We're going to be going quite pacily through this talk, but I'm going to begin by sort of talking quite theoretically, so you'll have to bear with me, on what passing is and how it's been conceptualized in a lot of the literature previously, before moving on to thinking more about the sort of specific dynamics that are occurring for bi people when we talk about this straight passing privilege or passing generally. I'll also talk about how we can push against this or reconceptualize it to try and make something else than this kind of comment and fight back against it, essentially. Importantly, I should start from the offset by saying that I am a sociologist by nature and training, and consequently I'm very interested in, and the contribution that I'm trying to make in this argument is very much around sort of looking at the social structures and the power dynamics and the relationships between people in society that are affecting this idea of passing. So I'm going to move on to the theory bit. So again, bear with me and talking about what is passing. So passing is not a new concept. It's something that's quite well embedded in a lot of literature within the social sciences. And there's a range of different definitions. So I've chosen two here, one of which is from the sociologist Goffman, who says that passing is, quote, the management of undisclosed discrediting information. A complementary yet different definition is presented here by Crutchfield, which says that passing is a cultural performance whereby one member of a defined social group masquerades as another. So what's important in these definitions is that more often than not, It is in fact people who are from minoritized groups who are passing to pass into more dominant social groups. So I'm going to give a bit more of a clear explanation of that through using an absolutely amazing novella. I really recommend it, actually. It's called Passing by Nella Larsen. And, you know, as the title might suggest, it's a really good exploration of passing. So this is much more about race and ethnicity. So the book was published in 1929, based in New York City, and it's about two women who could be said to be racialized as Black. This is already where language is starting to fall apart with these concepts, but they're light-skinned and choose to pass as white. So the two women, one is called Claire and one is called Irene, take very different paths to passing. So Claire chooses to pass permanently. That is, she marries a white man who is very racist, moves to white communities and cuts off any background to any sort of Black communities or anything similar. Whereas Irene chooses to pass opportunistically. So she only passes in dominantly white spaces to access spaces that she otherwise cannot access, because, you know, at this time, Jim Crow laws were still in play and there were places that were only accessible to white people. And so this whole novel, which I can't recommend strongly enough, is all about the difficulties of passing. It's about sort of the opportunities presented through it, sure, but mainly the undercurrent throughout is one of a torturous experience of almost having to pass. It's very claustrophobic. It's a very sort of isolating book. And I can also say it's actually very queer as well. So, you know, I do recommend it. But with that sort of example, then hopefully these definitions become a little bit more clear. So this idea of managing undisclosed discrediting information, or this idea of a cultural performance where one member of a defined social group is masquerading as another. You know, I think that that example helps elucidate that a little bit more. And over the course of the years, over the course of the social sciences literature, there's been many different theoretical takes on passing. So we can ask ourselves, is passing a secret knowledge? You know, does the person who is passing as something other than what they believe themselves to be, possessing a secret knowledge that they're guarding from a sort of wider audience, a wider public? We can also ask, is there a difference between passing, as in pretending to be or acting as something other than ourselves, versus covering, that is hiding something about ourselves? You know, can we differentiate between those two? We might also ask if there's a differentiation that we need to have between passing for reward, that is to access certain spaces, versus passing to avoid punishment. That is because our views are sort of unaccepted or guarded against. And something else that I think does come into play here is this idea of double consciousness, which is actually a concept presented by African-American early 20th century sociologist Du Bois, who argues that those who are minoritized tend to have a view behind the veil, I believe is how he calls it, which is that we possess a double consciousness in the sense of you can see the social structures around you, you can see what's discriminating against you, and you can see that it falls away to nothing, and that there's a sort of hidden knowledge that you can access there. Now, Du Bois is talking a lot more about race and ethnicity, but I think that that idea has merit in different spaces and for different minoritized groups as well. Importantly, when we think about passing, then there is a key issue here by Anderson, which we'll delve into even more a little bit later, which is the idea that the conceptualization of self is in part determined by how we appear to others and how others judge us according to that appearance. That is, only certain people can pass. It's about how you look, how you act, the language you can speak, the slang that you know, and so on and so forth, the sort of in-group knowledge that you're possessing. Those are the people that can pass, and it's somewhat limited as to who that might be. A further complication on passing, which I really want to stress, is that if you have to pass, or if you choose to pass, or if you are passing, you still have to come out at some point. there is either the threat of being exposed, there is the need to come out, a need to be who you are. You know, there's only so much covering or passing that one can do at one period of time. So that's a lot of the theory that we've skated through. So thank you for bearing with me on that, but I think it's really important context. Importantly, a lot of the literature around passing has often been discussed in relation to minoritized ethnicities and racialized communities. So obviously, there is the explanation of bi people as having straight passing privilege. And so that's where I think it's important for me to contextualize a little bit about bi identities before we move further into that argument. And I know that many of us who are attending this conference will either have experienced or studied or know a lot of what I'm about to say. So I'll skate through it. But I would argue that bi people generally are in a position that is full of hostile systems. So there are so many social systems and power structures that are working against bi people's expression of self and ability to be oneself. So we can think about, as a pretty evident example, heteronormativity. Heteronormativity is one model where heterosexuality is prized, it's considered to be more normal, it's considered to be more typical, and it's considered to be what most children will grow up to be compared to other sexual expressions and sexual identities. Relatedly, we can think of cisnormativity as being a huge hostile system that needs unpicking. So cisnormativity is the idea that it is more typical or usual to be cisgender as opposed to, for example, trans or non-binary. And that in itself sets up a system where you are what you were born, and there are two genders, and they are complementary to one another. So cisnormativity in many ways reinforces and consolidates systems of heteronormativity. And the third hostile system or component that I think is worth mentioning when considering bi people's movements in society is that of monosexism. So a relatively controversial concept, and quite rightly so, but monosexism is the idea that it is more correct, normal, appropriate, or expected for people to have a single gender interest. So that is, you expect someone to be heterosexual, gay, or lesbian, but if someone is bisexual, then it is questioned as to whether they're passing through a phase, whether they're unsure, whether they're just being greedy, whether they're confused. You know, all of these kind of comments are indicative of a monosexist perspective. So heteronormativity, cisnormativity, monosexism, all complicated, far too long, way too many syllables for me to say that quickly, words, which reinforce hostile systems that bi people have to negotiate and experience. There are, of course, more systems that I could talk about here. I could discuss white privilege, I could discuss ableism, I could discuss classism. All of these are also central issues that prop up those other systems and are worth taking into account, but I won't go into them in as much detail. I do, however, want to split out this idea of cis heterosexual spaces and LGBTQ spaces in relation to bi identities to explain a little bit the context and experience of bi people in these spaces. So cis heterosexual spaces, of course, are designed much with heteronormativity and cisnormativity in mind. You know, we find that the sort of commonplace media representation, whilst improving, is still very much focused on presenting heterosexual ideals. So differently gendered couples, families, so on, all heterosexual specifically. And this is reinforced not only in media representation, but we see it in things like healthcare access, healthcare policy, who is discussed and who is included in things like maternity, parenting. You know, if you're a non-binary person navigating fertility services, for example, that's going to be very difficult, as a lot of the work of Sally Hines has shown. And we can also see it in things like governmental policy, where, you know, up until very recently, marriage was between men and women, and that came with its own sort of tax benefits, tax breaks, and legal right to people's lives, and so on and so forth. So the dominant social space is just set up for cis heterosexual people, largely. However, we also see some complexities within LGBTQ spaces, and I know that there's been quite a lot of speakers who have referenced this in far greater detail today, and will do so over the course of the rest of the day. But suffice to say, for people who experience or who identify with minoritized genders or sexualities, then there is a belief that an LGBTQ space, or a space for all minoritized sexualities and genders, is home. You know, that will be the space that is welcome for people who deviate from that cis heterosexual norm. And in the research that I've conducted with various bi people, this is how most people have sort of framed how they had hoped to view LGBTQ spaces. However, the reality is, the research demonstrates that LGBTQ spaces can be very hostile to bi people and the inclusion of bi people. You know, we know that there are instances where people will refuse to date bi people for fear that they'll leave them for a differently gendered partner. We know that bi people feel uncomfortable attending things like pride parades or other queer spaces with a differently gendered partner. And we know that there is a lot of generally stigma and discrimination within LGBTQ spaces that, from the people that I've spoken to in the course of my research, has felt all the more harmful because it was supposed to be home. It was supposed to be the safe space, right? So what's sort of underpinning all of this is this idea of biphobia, essentially. And there's this wonderful quote by Hayfield, who's an excellent scholar in the field of bisexuality, which says, bisexual women are sometimes positioned as really lesbian, but more often are represented as really heterosexual and as kissing other women in order to titillate and seek the attention of heterosexual men. Now, Hayfield here is, of course, talking about the dynamic for bisexual women. As we know, and as a panel I was just in also referenced, bisexual men are far more understudied, and we just do not have enough evidence to chart the same sort of degree of knowledge around them as we do about women. But what research does show is that bi men also experience biphobia, perhaps in a slightly different way, but in a very rampant gendered way. So biphobia underpins, you know, the life of bi people, whatever gender they present as or identify with. There are all of these interlocking social systems which are sort of working against the bi person in many ways. In my previous research, asking bi people where they found community, there were very little positive answers, honestly, and it was very much a case of finding individuals as opposed to fitting into group spaces. And I think that this is a common experience. So now I'd like to turn to thinking about, okay, if that's the context of bi people, and those are the social dynamics that we understand bi people to exist in, how can we understand this passing as a straight privilege? How is that kind of comment operationalized, or how is it made, generally speaking? So I've drawn out some examples here. Generally, we see this as either explicit or implicit. So explicitly, we see that there's the basic statement that bi people have heterosexual or heteroromantic privilege in itself, just as a statement. We may also see that some people level that bi people in heterosexual relationships do not experience discrimination. Now, I take a very big issue with that statement, because of course we know that bi people are at greater risk of domestic violence, sexual violence, and experience worse mental health than other sexual identities. So that statement very much feeds my ire. You'll also notice that I've put here heterosexual in quote marks, and whilst tangential, I want to explain why. It's because I am very irritated by the fact that bi people are so regularly defined by the relationship that they are in. So Why is the bi person in a heterosexual relationship when they are with someone of a different gender, as opposed to the other person being in a bi relationship, for example? Why is a bi person in a gay relationship? Why isn't it all just a queer relationship? That's my bugbear, and that's probably another talk. But I'll move on to thinking about the more implicit examples of bi privilege, which are statements along the lines of they'll leave you for insert gender. And also something that I see quite frequently and surprisingly, which is that bi people should fight harder for LGBT rights because they may not experience as much discrimination due to their heterosexual privilege. And I always find that quite disconcerting. And, you know, Amber Alt is one person who has written about this idea of bi straight passing privilege. And there's this wonderful quote in one of her pieces, which is, the figure of the bisexual becomes a self-divided, a composite self dependent upon the dominant sexual binary for coherence and cultural comprehension. What that means is that bi people aren't seen as bi, they are seen as half gay, half straight. They're seen as sometimes passing through a heterosexual phase, sometimes passing through a gay phase, a lesbian for now, but straight later on. You know, it's never that bi people are fully, wholly, completely understood as bisexual. It's always a 50-50 or a time-oriented segment of one's life, as opposed to a whole existence, a life course of bisexuality. And I think that that's a very insightful quote by Alt. I'm now going to talk a little bit about the mechanisms of passing for bi identities. And, you know, as I've referred to throughout this talk, then typically bi privilege is mobilized in a way that actually tries to demonstrate bi people's heterosexual privilege. You know, very often it's that they're passing as straight. And whilst there has been very little research done about bi passing explicitly, then again, Alt has done some really good work on this. And Alt found in a study of bisexual women, so again, we're lacking a piece of the puzzle here in looking at other genders, particularly men, but also non-binary people. But Alt found that, yes, some bisexual women did reside comfortably in heterosexuality. However, more so tended to align themselves more strongly with lesbian and bisexual lesbian communities through their use of terminology and through sort of their perspectives on the world. Alt writes, by locating themselves under these signs, bisexuals seek to participate in larger political and discursive formations. That is, there was a greater alignment with sort of a queer struggle than there was in terms of fitting into the heteronormative model. So this is something that has been found in my own work, my own research that I've conducted. I wrote a paper about bi people and their use of fashion, but it's also present in my forthcoming book, which Tara Lynn referenced. And in interviewing a range of different bi people of various different genders, then I was looking at identity management and also how people manage their relationships with other people, whether it was a romantic or sexual partner, whether it was a family member or a friend, sometimes a workplace. You know, these are all things that I've been exploring over the course of my career so far. And what I have generally found is that for the most part, and of course we can never say anything totalizing in qualitative research, but for the most part, amongst the people that I spoke to, then bi people want to be seen as bi. They want to be understood as not straight and not gay. However, the reality is that there is a huge absence of ways in which to become visible. You know, how can you look bisexual? It's a question that continuously returns. And there's been some brilliant work by a range of scholars, including Hayfield and many others, about a sort of identity presentation and how people sort of negotiate it. Is it mixing in different gendered clothes? Is it using femininity and masculinity in interesting ways? How can one look bisexual? And this is sort of the problem with this idea of bypassing privilege, because there's a presumption that bisexual should be visible, but they're invisible. There's an assumption that we can know who someone is by looking at them, but really we need to be told. There's an idea that we need to know that someone is bisexual, and we can't know. And of course, underscoring all of this is this problem of intentionality. Are people intentionally passing to access privilege, or are they intentionally passing to avoid discrimination? And so sort of, again, thinking about this through different lenses, I've turned to a few different ideas around identity management. So Goffman, a sociologist, says that we manage our identities depending on our audience. Butler, a queer theorist, has said that maybe we perform according to an ideal that we cannot reach because it absolutely doesn't exist. I've argued that maybe we're dressing and acting according to social ideals and trying to make a composition of self on that basis. And, you know, Hayfield sometimes raises the question, or I find myself asking the question, that maybe we're doomed to misrecognition anyway. If we turn it on its head, and sort of begin to think about it from the other approach, then we could argue that actually there's a real danger behind visibility. You know, those hostile social structures I referred to earlier still persist and still exist and can actively harm bi people who are in the wrong spaces. If we turn Butler on their head, then there's an expectation of what we become. In many ways, discourse and expectation in society has already pressed into us what they want to see. And thinking about my idea turned on its head, if there's an ideal we're trying to demonstrate, what does that even look like for bi people? Continuing with Hayfield, there's no social possibilities for a bi expression. And I'm thinking visually, how can we do that? And I think that this quote really stuck out to me when I was engaging in the passing literature, when I was looking through a lot of the theory, which is by De Jordi, who says that passing always has a significant and serious consequence, because identity information, once revealed, cannot be reconcealed, at least not within the particular context in which it was revealed. And I would heavily argue that is absolutely not the case for bi people. For those of us in the room who may identify as bi, or for those of us who are immersed in the research in the social sciences side of bi, we know that no matter how many times someone tries to reaffirm their identity, it's still forgotten or glossed over or retorted with a, but really you're gay, right? Or isn't that just on the step to heterosexuality? So we know that passing, once revealed, can be returned to passing for bi people, because people refuse to believe bi people a lot of the time, which begs the question, if we return to this idea of secret knowledge, then who is really holding the power? Are bi people passing, or are they being forced to pass, in a sense? And so now this reaches the part where I'll really begin to get into the strong meat of the argument, which is to argue against the idea of any presumed bypassing privilege. And I've got a sort of 6-point retort to some of the work here. So my first argument against bi people having heterosexual passing privilege would be that actually it's a case of hiding oneself. You know, it is a fact that through passing one has to not reveal an element of oneself, and that's usually related to issues around safety and discrimination, as opposed to anything sort of intentionally deceptive, as I found in the research so far. If we're thinking about passing as something that is almost accidental or unintentional, then the reality is that for people who presume bi people to be heterosexual or gay based on their partner, it's always a case of defining someone by their relationship. As so much research argues within bi studies and the social sciences, bi people struggle with this, particularly when in differently gendered relationships. The idea of not being seen for what one is can be very difficult, and some people can find actually being in a relationship with someone of a different gender difficult because of this, because they are then not as politically aligned by virtue of their partner with queer communities, for example. Similarly, then to presume that someone is heterosexual also presumes monogamy, and we know that a lot of bi people are polyamorous and that people do engage in polyamorous relationships. But perhaps more centrally, this sort of bypassing privilege idea continuously reaffirms monosexism, again arguing that you can only be appearing heterosexual or gay or lesbian, because how can you appear bisexual? It always returns to this question. I find it very difficult to answer. I'd be very interested to hear other people's thoughts. And my perhaps greatest issue is that this is sometimes a heteronormative argument, because if you're saying that there is a sort of privilege associated with identifying as heterosexual beyond avoiding discrimination and so on and so forth, and that's reaffirming the dominance and the preponderance of heterosexuality. Finally, to suggest that someone is passing as a privilege is in itself presuming a privilege, because some people can only pass, some people can only be out as bi if they're in an environment where it's safe to, if they have certain protective factors, which could include things like class, race, gender expression, their partner, so on and so forth. So it's a very difficult argument to make and to unpick. So one thing that Alt has also said, which is that I'll just read the quote. So, appending ambiguous subjects to marginalized groups erases important features of the experience of those marked by the stigma of categorical excess or inadequacy. In the case of bisexuals, such conceptualizations reproduce the binary hetero and homo divide, elide the direct relationship between the dominant heterosexual and ambiguous bisexual categories, and leave observers with the impression that ambiguous subjects are most significantly oppressed by an already dominated group, in this instance by lesbians. I think Alt's reminder here is very important to nuance and respond to the argument that I've made thus far, that it is crucial to think about sort of the social structures and the operations working around us, so that we're not just reproducing sort of dominance and control to those in LGBTQ communities who are sort of countering bi experiences. So I'd like to move on now to talking about the implications of this passing discourse, why I care about it at all, and why I have devised this keynote to respond to it. And you know, the foremost case of which is the idea of minorities, stress, discrimination, and bi people. We know that bi people occupy very specific spaces in a social sexual dynamic, in that they experience heteronormativity, and they experience homophobia when with someone of a different gender, but they also experience biphobia from heterosexual people and larger queer communities. What this means is that bi people, you know, experience 1,000 pinpricks essentially. And we can see that in terms of some of the outcomes for bi people. Bi people tend to have worse mental health along the lines of depression, suicidality, self-harm, eating disorders. And these studies have been conducted in the USA, I believe Canada, UK, and Australia, and that's where I'm largely speaking to here. But these things are continuously sort of impacting bi people in a very material way. It's a sort of constant onslaught of stigma and are you sure? Do you really mean that? What are you? Or covering their identity in some way, which really continues to harm bi people. You know, we know broadly that we have a very significant lack of understanding. We know that there isn't enough scholarship around bi people. We know that there isn't enough enough funding for bi activism. We know that there isn't enough research on specific subgroups within bi communities. So we know very little about men and even less about non-binary and trans bi people. There's almost a very limited amount of knowledge we have about more intersectional identities within bi communities. So race, ethnicity, class, disability, these are all things that we just do not know enough about. And this lack of understanding means that we aren't able to put in protective factors to be able to support bi people. And I think that that sort of idea of straight passing privilege continues to distract from these very real issues. So how can we talk about this otherwise? You know, this is a really central question in terms of how might we retort to the times in which these statements of bi people having straight passing privilege come up. And, you know, it's always a case of punch upwards, not downwards. The real villains in these stories are those social systems that I detailed earlier. It's heteronormativity, it's cisnormativity, it's monosexism. These are the villains, because these structures are the things that are stopping people from living free and unburdened lives. It's stopping people from being able to experience their sexualities, their genders, their behaviors and their expressions freely without fear of discrimination and without fear of castigation in one way or another. So I think any conversation around this kind of idea of bypassing privilege needs to almost redirect to tackle the real issue. As we know, and as many of us research, live, or experience, bi people have a set of very specific and serious problems and barriers in everyday life that aren't typically accounted for due to the absence of research. And it would serve us better to refocus any attention on conversations around bi privilege towards these real issues. So with that, I'm going to tie up. I feel like I've talked very long, so thank you for bearing with me. And I'm also aware that it's been somewhat theoretical and relatively early stage research. So I'll be very interested to hear your thoughts, any kind of added nuance or arguments you think would be important here. Because this is the beginning of a journey into this topic for me. And I would love to hear any thoughts or experiences that chime in with it at all. So I think that I can open up the floor to questions if that's the case. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and open up if that's all right, Carolyn.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Rosie. That was a very engaging and insightful presentation. And we do have a number of questions. So I will start off with our first. So while dating, do you consider that this kind of option, bi plus having a hetero passing privilege, should be a deal breaker?
So I'm interpreting that question as the partner presuming that the bi person has heterosexual passing privilege as a deal breaker. I mean, well, it depends on the person. I think that if that is sort of, you know, it's very up to whoever is in the dating experience as to what you want to teach your partner about effectively, or if you actually agree or anything else. So I can't say whether or not it's a deal breaker for an individual, but personally, I would endeavor to open a discussion. I have found in most of my dating life, and I don't know if other people have experienced the same, that regardless of who I'm dating, where they're located, who they are, what gender they are, I still often have to teach about bisexuality. And it depends if someone wants to take that on or not.
I hear that. The next question, how do you incentivize shy bisexuals, or how could you incentivize shy bisexuals to embrace their full identity?
So I assume that this question is related to coming out and being sort of a loud and proud bisexual, so to say.
Yeah, and visible, I would add.
And visible, yes. So I think that now there's many takes on this, right? Because no one should be forced to come out. I mean, really, the reality of having to come out is, again, sadly, responding to the heteronormative way in which the world works. Everyone's assumed straight until otherwise declared, and in the case of bisexuals, then often forgotten about and assumed to be straight again. But what that means is that the very act of coming out, I would argue, is a violent act for people, because they have been forced to express themselves as something other than the norm, right? What that means in practice is I would never ask anyone to come out who didn't feel comfortable, but I would ask for those that do feel comfortable and do feel that they have protective factors and would be able to sort of weather some ill-informed comments or potential discrimination to sort of occupy those spaces and come out loudly and proudly. Again, I think that changing the lens to punching up, not down. If someone is not out, then they probably don't feel comfortable to be out in one way or another, because something is stopping them, whether that's a fear of discrimination, a conservative family member. And so pivot the lens and ask, how can spaces be made more comfortable for people to perhaps not even need to come out? You know, that's the ideal world, isn't it? But yeah, that would be my answer to that. Not really an answer, more of a sidestep, I'm afraid.
No, that's great. Thank you. And one of the big themes today has been around visibility and invisibility. And obviously that type of discourse is inseparable from discussions around passing, like what you're offering here today. And in one of our earlier sessions, Sherry Eisner mentioned that visibility without liberation makes us targets. So I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on that in relation to, what you're talking about here, privilege and passing.
I think that that's a really insightful way of looking at things. Like, yeah, visibility without liberation making us targets. I think that's an incredible way of summarizing it. Because there does need to be the support there to make sure that, okay, if we come out as visible, then that we're not going to, lose our jobs, lose our friends, lose our family, lose our relationships, and so on. Sorry, I immediately lost track of the question because I was enjoying that quote. What was it that you'd like me to respond to, just in terms of how this fits in with the broader?
Yeah, what your thoughts are about the idea that visibility without liberation makes us targets in relation to the ideas around, passing and privilege.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I'm with you now. Yeah, I think that they sort of go hand in hand in a sense, because again, this is reinforcing that passing is not a privilege, because it's the fact of we need the liberation to be out. So if someone, generally speaking, if someone is not out or is only quietly out, it's because of fear of reprisal. It's because of fear of retaliation. It's not generally because of a lack of ownership over the self. In terms of the research that I've conducted, that's what I have found amongst people, that there is a very select group of people that some people feel comfortable being out to, and it's for fear of not getting the next opportunity at work, having to experience biphobic comments or homophobic comments, and so on. So I think the sort of the idea of liberation being needed to be out is really central and goes hand in hand with the idea of passing not being a privilege. It's a necessity for many.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that ties well into our next question. So it's interesting that in your research, you recognize that most bi+ people do not want to be read as straight or gay, and yet there's still this discussion of there being a privilege. So the question is, have you found that when this bi+ privilege is discussed, it is also acknowledged that this experience of passing comes at a great cost?
So in the experience of having spoken to people about their identities and where and when they're talking about it, or wanting to be out but feeling that they couldn't be out for some reason or another, it is, my interpretation of what people have said is that it does come at a cost. It is very much a recognition that the world isn't fair. It's a recognition that people would treat them differently if they knew more about them. And that sort of projection that they're already feeling is hurtful. It is harmful. It's thinking that one doesn't have a place. And so that there is a great cost there. And there's also examples of people, and I'm sure that you can think of our own lives, people we know, other research that we've read, of people being caught at the wrong moment when they weren't in the passing mode, and they were being sort of exposed or outed accidentally, or weren't being careful enough in one way or another. And that also was very harmful and jarring. So it's always giving away something. It's not, in my research and in having read a lot around this, I haven't really encountered many people passing for the pure privilege and pleasure of being able to say that they were heterosexual or so on. It's always been for safety or to avoid rejection. And that also does go the other way. There's this amazing book called Real Life Nude Girl by Carol. It's either Carol Queen or Carol McQueen. I can't quite remember. And in it, then it talks about the experience of being bi and relating to lesbians. Thank you. It's Carol Queen. Someone's just told me. Being bi and relating to lesbian groups and just passing as lesbian for fear of rejection. So it goes a lot of ways, but it's always a trade-off, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I know in the workplace, for example, it's definitely a double-edged sword where you have the benefit of safety and protection, no loss or no threat of career harm, but on the other hand, lots of feelings of isolation and alienation as well. That leads to eventually a lot of disengagement. If there are no other questions from the audience, I would like to thank you again, Rosie. I think that this was an amazing talk. I think that there's a lot of resonance with our audience. So thank you again for this terrific talk. Lots of very positive comments in the chat, which I'm sure you'll get to read. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you in our next session. Thanks again, Rosie.